Garnett, Montana Territory, the 9th of October, 1886. The sun still held its warmth at noon, a golden fraud that made men whistle while they stacked cordwood and made women hang laundry without gloves. But the light was a liar. It had been lying since September, shortening itself by minutes each day, retreating south like a deserter who knows what is coming. For Bryn Cadogan, the warmth carried no comfort. It carried only the quiet arithmetic of doom. Her husband, Ellis, had died on the 23rd of September, crushed beneath a wagon wheel that shattered on the mountain road above town while hauling ore from the Mammoth mine. The teamster driving behind him said Ellis had tried to grab the brake lever and missed. That was the whole story. A hand reaching for iron and finding air. 3 weeks of a life reduced to a single failed gesture. The mine paid her $14 in back wages and nothing more. There was no pension for a teamster's widow. There was no company house, either, because the room above the assay office where they had lived belonged to the mine, and the mine had already hired a new man, a German with thick forearms and a wife who could cook for boarders. The notice came on a Tuesday, not nailed to a door because they had no door of their own, just a curtain that separated their room from the hallway. The mine superintendent, a man named Croft, delivered it in person. He stood in the doorway holding his hat against his chest as though he were attending a funeral, which in a way he was. "Mrs. Cadogan, I have spoken with the company in Helena," he said. His voice was not cruel. It had the careful, rehearsed quality of a man who had practiced his speech on the walk-over. "The room is needed by the 15th. I have arranged passage on the mail coach to Deer Lodge, where you might find work at the hotel or the laundry." "It is a reasonable arrangement." Bryn looked at him. She was 27 years old, was dark Welsh hair pulled back so tightly it tugged at her temples, and hands that were already rough from 3 years of frontier work. She had been mending a pair of Ellis's trousers when Croft arrived, a habit she had not yet broken, sewing clothes for a man who would never wear them again. "And if I choose to stay in Garnett?" she asked. Croft put his hat back on. "There is nothing for you in Garnett, Mrs. Cadogan. You have no claim, no trade, and no family. I say this with respect." He paused at the curtain, and something crossed his face then, a flicker that was almost shame. He reached into his coat and set $2 silver on the table beside the door. "For the coach fare," he said quietly. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs. Bryn did not touch the coins. She was an outsider twice over. A widow in a mining camp that valued men by the weight they could haul, and a Welsh immigrant whose father's knowledge of European forestry meant nothing in a territory where trees were obstacles between a man and his mineral claim. Her accent alone set her apart. The way she softened her consonants and stretched her vowels, a music that sounded foreign and therefore suspicious. The women of Garnett tolerated her the way one tolerates a stray cat that appears on the porch, with a saucer of milk and a closed door. When the 15th came, 2 men from the mine carried her belongings down the stairs and set them in the street. A trunk of clothes, a wooden box containing Ellis's tools, his hatchet, his hand drill, his farrier's rasp, a canvas sack of flour and dried beans, and a small leather-bound journal that had belonged not to Ellis but to her father, Iorwerth Cadogan, a forester from Denbighshire, who had died of typhus on the crossing to America 11 years earlier, when Bryn was 16. She had carried that journal across an ocean and half a continent. It smelled of pine pitch and lanolin, and its pages were filled with her father's tiny, meticulous handwriting. Diagrams of root systems, soil temperatures, the thermal properties of living wood. The town watched her from behind glass. She could feel their eyes, not hostile but calculating, the way one watches a wounded animal and measures the distance to one's own door. Pity was there, she knew, but pity was a winter creek. It ran shallow and froze fast. She thought of her father, not the dying man on the ship, yellow-skinned and delirious, but the living one, the one who had walked her through the forests of North Wales and taught her to press her palm against the bark of an ancient yew and feel the warmth still held inside from the afternoon sun. "The surface is a fool, Brennan," he had told her once, kneeling beside a fallen beech to show her the pale mycelium threading through its heartwood. "Everything important happens underneath. The roots talk to each other. The soil remembers the summer. A tree is not wood. A tree is a conversation between the sun and the earth, and the wood is just the language they use." She had not understood him then. She was beginning to now. There was a church at the edge of Garnet, not a proper church, really, but the skeleton of one, a log structure that a Methodist circuit rider had begun building 2 summers ago before the silver price dropped and half his congregation left for better strikes in Idaho. The walls stood 8 feet high, roofless, the squared logs already silvering with weather. The floor was bare earth. A colony of pale moths had taken up residence in the gaps between the logs, small gray things that fluttered in the dusk like scraps of old paper. The town had forgotten the building entirely. It sat in a clearing backed by a granite ridge, surrounded by lodgepole pines that grew so thick their lower branches interlocked like the fingers of clasped hands. Brynid walked past it dozens of times gathering firewood. She'd never given it a second thought, but on the evening of October 15th, standing in the street with her possessions piled around her like a cairn, she thought of it. She thought of the granite ridge behind it, how the rock face caught the afternoon sun and held its heat long after dark. She thought of the earth floor, how it would stay a constant temperature if properly insulated from above. She thought of her father's journal, page 47, where he had sketched the cross-section of a Welsh longhouse built into a hillside, its back wall the living rock itself, and written in the margin, "The mountain does not fight the winter, it swallows it." She loaded what she could onto her back and began walking. The hollow church, as she came to think of it, was worse than it looked from the road. The logs were unseasoned and had begun to check and split. The chinking between them was non-existent. Wind moved through the walls as freely as light through a sieve. The earth floor was damp, packed hard in some places and soft in others, where rain had pooled and sat. A family of deer mice had built a nest in the southeast corner, a tidy ball of shredded bark and grass. But Bryn did not see failure. She saw potential measured in thermal mass. The first thing she did was dig. Using Ellis's hatchet and a flat stone as a crude shovel, she began excavating the floor of the church, deepening it by 2 feet. The work took her 4 days. She piled the excavated earth outside in long mounds, knowing she would need it later. As she dug, the soil changed character. The top layer was cold and damp, but 18 inches down it became drier, denser, and noticeably warmer. She pressed her bare hand against it and felt what her father had described, the residual heat of summer, stored in the earth like money in a bank, waiting to be drawn upon. She cut pine boughs and laid them in thick layers over the exposed earth floor, then covered them with flat stones she hauled from a creek bed 200 yards downhill. The stones were smooth, heavy, river-worn granite, and they served a double purpose. They created a dry, solid floor, and their density meant they would absorb and hold heat far longer than wood. Next, she addressed the walls. She did not try to chink them in the conventional way, stuffing moss and clay into the gaps. Instead, she built a second wall, using the excavated earth mixed with pine needles and creek water. She packed a thick layer of cob, a full 18 inches, against the outside of the log walls, starting at the base and working upward. Where the logs had split and checked, she filled the cracks from the inside with a paste of clay and ash. The moths that lived in the gaps relocated themselves calmly to the upper courses of logs above her mudline, as though they had negotiated a treaty. She watched them in the evenings, those moths. They were unremarkable creatures, dusty grey with wingspans no wider than her thumbnail. But they fascinated her. They were drawn not to her small fire, but to the warming walls, landing on the places where the thermal mass was highest. Their tiny bodies pressed flat against the clay as though drinking the heat. She began to use them as instruments, checking which sections of her walls held warmth and which leaked it. Where the moths gathered, the insulation was good. Where they avoided, she added more cob. It was during the third week that she noticed something that stopped her breath. She had been studying the moths by candlelight, watching them settle on a section of wall she had finished that morning. When she saw the pattern, a cluster of 6 moths had arranged themselves on the damp clay, their wings slightly spread. And the shapes they made, the angles of their wings against the dark surface, looked like letters. Not English letters, Welsh. The angular ancient script her father had used in the margins of his journal when he wanted to write something private. She stared for a long time. She knew it was coincidence, the random settling of insects on a warm surface. But the shapes persisted, and her father's voice rose in her memory, unbidden. Koffia, the moth seemed to spell. Remember. She opened the journal to page 47 and kept working. By the first week of November, the shelter had taken shape. She had framed a roof using lodgepole pine poles lashed with strips of elm bark, then layered it with pine boughs, then a thick cap of sod cut from a nearby meadow. The sod was alive, threaded with grass roots that would bind together over the winter and create a waterproof, insulating seal. She built a small fireplace against the granite ridge at the back wall. Not a conventional hearth, but a long, low structure of stacked stone that snaked along the base of the rock face before venting through a clay-lined flue in the corner. Her father's journal called this a hypercourse channel, a principle borrowed from the Romans, where the heat and smoke from a small fire traveled a long horizontal path before exiting, surrendering their warmth to the surrounding stone along the way. The granite ridge itself was her secret weapon, 12 feet of solid rock that had been absorbing solar heat since April. It would radiate that stored warmth slowly, steadily, for months, even as the air temperature outside dropped to 40 below. She was not heating a room. She was releasing heat that the earth had already collected. Silas Blackwood found her on a bright, cold morning in mid-November. Blackwood was the owner of the Garnet sawmill and the man who supplied lumber to every structure in town. He was broad-shouldered, competent, and certain in the way that successful men on the frontier tended to be certain, with the quiet authority of someone who had never been proven fundamentally wrong. He had come to salvage the abandoned church logs for milling. And what he found instead was Bryn Cadogan on her knees, packing earth against a wall with her bare hands, her forearms streaked with grey clay. He stood at the edge of the clearing and watched for a full minute before speaking. "Mrs. Cadogan," he said, not unkindly, "what are you doing to this building? I'm living in it, Mr. Blackwood." He walked closer, examining her work with the critical eye of a man who had been building structures for 20 years. He pressed his thumb into the cob wall and frowned. "This is mud. You have buried a log wall in mud and put grass on the roof. This will not survive December. The freeze-thaw will crack your mud to pieces. The snow load will collapse that roof. You are building a coffin." Bryn wiped her hands on her apron. "You may be right," she said, and then she went back to work. That exchange became a story in Garnet, told with the head-shaking amusement reserved for those who have clearly lost their senses. The Welsh widow was living in the ruined church. She had packed it with mud like a swallow building a nest. She talked to moths. Blackwood himself repeated it at the sawmill, not with malice, but with the resigned certainty of a man delivering a forecast. "She will not last to Christmas," he said, The first hard freeze will drive her out, and if it does not, the January storms will bury her alive." He said this while sharpening a saw blade, and there was a moment when his hand paused on the steel and his jaw tightened, and anyone watching closely might have seen that his certainty cost him something. He had a daughter Bryn's age, married to a rancher in the Bitterroot Valley, and the thought of her alone in a mud-packed ruin flickered across his mind like a moth across a candle. He shook it off and kept sharpening. Winter came not as a visitor, but as a verdict. The first blizzard struck on December 3rd. It came down from Canada like a white wall, dropping temperatures to 30 below zero in a matter of hours. The wind was a living thing, a howling, clawing force that found every crack in every cabin and drove needles of ice through gaps that had seemed insignificant in October. The snow fell for 3 days without pause, piling in drifts that buried fence lines and blocked the road to Deer Lodge completely. Garnet hunkered down. Fires roared in every cabin. Wood piles that had seemed generous in autumn began to shrink with alarming speed. The problem with conventional cabins, the problem that Blackwood's expertise had never solved, was that they were designed to keep cold out rather than to hold warmth in. The log walls, even well chinked, conducted heat outward. The fires had to burn constantly, consuming wood at a rate that turned the winter's supply into a month's. And when the wind found the gaps, and it always found the gaps, the heat fled like a startled animal, and the fire had to burn harder, and the wood vanished faster. Inside the hollow church, Bryn fed her hypercaused fire twice a day. Small fires, pine and the dense, slow-burning roots of juniper she had stockpiled in October. The smoke traveled through the stone channel, warming the rock, then exited through the flue in a thin, barely visible wisp. The granite ridge behind her radiated its ancient, stored warmth. The thick cob walls held the interior heat like a clay pot holds soup. The sod roof, now frozen solid, was a perfect insulator, a foot of ice and earth and tangled roots that stopped heat loss as effectively as any modern material would. The temperature inside her shelter held at a steady 52 degrees. She did not shiver. She did not huddle. She worked. She mended clothes. She read her father's journal by candlelight. She watched the moths which had not died or fled, but had entered a state of torpor on the warm upper walls, their wings folded, their tiny bodies tucked into the clay-like seeds waiting for spring. The second blizzard came on December 19th, the third on January 2nd. By mid-January, Garnet was in crisis. 3 cabins had lost their roofs to snow load. The communal woodpile was gone. Families were burning furniture. 2 elderly prospectors in a cabin at the north end of town were found frozen in their beds, their fire dead, their wood supply exhausted. The cold had killed them quietly, like a thief. Silas Blackwood stood on his porch on the morning of January 16th, staring at the thermometer nailed to the post. 41 below zero. His own house, the finest in Garnet, was holding at 38 degrees inside despite a fire that had consumed a quarter wood in the night. His wife slept in her coat. His hands, when he removed his gloves to read the thermometer, ached instantly, the cold biting into his knuckles like a living thing. He thought of the Welsh widow. He had not thought of her in weeks. He had assumed she was dead, another casualty filed away in the mental ledger of frontier losses. But a hunter had come in from the canyon 2 days ago and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that smoke was still rising from the old church ruin. Thin smoke, steady smoke, the smoke of a fire that was not fighting for its life. Blackwood walked to the hollow church that afternoon. It took him an hour through waist-deep snow. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. The building had vanished, or rather, it had become part of the landscape, a low, snow-covered mound backed by the granite ridge. indistinguishable from the terrain except for the thin thread of smoke rising from one corner and the narrow path that had been kept clear to the entrance. The path was lined with flat stones that radiated a faint warmth he could feel through his boot soles. Bryn emerged from the low doorway. She was wearing a wool dress and a shawl. No coat. Her cheeks were pink, not from cold, but from the warmth of the interior behind her. She looked at Blackwood the way one looks at a neighbor who has come for a visit, with polite expectation. Blackwood stood there in his 3 layers of wool and his beaver fur hat, ice crystals in his beard, his body shaking with a cold that had seeped past every defense he had built in 20 years of frontier construction. She stood before him in a shawl. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, the authority was gone from his voice. What remained was something raw, something that had been stripped of pretense by 6 weeks of losing a war he had been certain he could win. "How?" he said. Bryn studied him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the frost damage on his cheeks, the way his hands trembled inside his gloves. She saw a man who had built his life on knowing how things worked, and had discovered, at the worst possible moment, that he did not. "Come inside," she said. He ducked through the entrance and the warmth folded around him like water. It was not the dry, aggressive heat of a roaring fire. It was a deep warmth, ambient and steady, rising from the stone floor and the clay walls and the granite ridge that formed the back of the shelter. He pulled off a glove and placed his hand against the inner wall. It was warm, not hot. Warm, the steady, patient warmth of living rock. He stood there with his bare hand on the wall and said nothing. His eyes were bright. "You build walls to block the cold," Bryn said. "My father taught me to build walls that remember the warmth. Your cabin fights the winter. This place does not fight. It simply holds what the summer gave it and lets it go slowly." "Show me," Blackwood said. His voice was hoarse. "Show me how it works." She showed him the hypercast channel, lifting a stone to reveal the passage where warm air traveled beneath the floor. She showed him the cob walls, explaining how the mass of earth absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. She showed him the sod roof, the clay-lined flue, the way the granite ridge acted as a thermal reservoir. She used no technical language. She used the words her father had used. "Give the heat a home," she said. "A stone home, not a wooden cage. Heat is loyal. It will stay where it is welcomed." Blackwood returned to Garnet that evening and did not sleep. By morning he had drawn plans. Within a week, working with every able-bodied man in town, he began retrofitting the cabins using Bryn's principles. They banked earth against north-facing walls. They built interior stone masses around their fireplaces, heavy columns of river rock that absorbed heat and radiated it for hours after the fire died. They sealed their roofs with sod. They learned to burn less and hold more. Garnet survived that winter. Not all frontier towns did. By spring, when the snow pulled back from the meadows like a retreating tide, Bryn's hollow church had become a landmark. People came from other camps to see it. They touched the walls. They sat inside and felt the warmth. They asked questions and Bryn answered them patiently, completely, with no price and no bitterness. She never left Garnet. She became the person others consulted before they built. The quiet woman with clay under her fingernails, who could look at a hillside and tell you where the earth held its heat. They called her methods the Cadogan Way, and the principles spread through the mining camps of western Montana like seeds carried on a spring wind. On the first warm evening of April, Bryn sat at the entrance to her shelter and opened her father's journal for the last time. A single father, that verse to wake from its winter torpor, crawled from a gap in the upper wall and settled on the page. It rested there on the sketch of the Welsh longhouse, its wings spread flat against the old ink, and in the fading light its grey wings looked for all the world like a small hand laid gently over her father's drawing. She did not brush it away. She sat with it, the two of them quiet in the doorway, the evening air carrying the smell of wet pine and new grass. And she listened to the slow tick of the warming stones releasing the last of the winter's stored heat behind her. That is the story of Bryn Cadogan. But this is not really about a woman in a ruined church in Montana. This is about you. We all build the same way. We stack our defenses higher. We burn through our resources faster. We trust the experts who build the same walls, slightly thicker each time, and we are stunned each winter when the cold finds its way in anyway. We mock the strange solutions, the ones that look like mud and madness, because they do not look like what we have been taught to trust. What about you? What half-built abandoned structure in your life have you walked past 100 times without seeing its potential? What knowledge did someone give you, a parent, a mentor, a stranger, that you filed away as quaint and impractical, as too simple to matter? What wall are you building thicker when what you need is to build it differently? The world will tell you it is foolishness. Your experts will shake their heads. They will call it mud. They will call it a coffin. But the moths know where the warmth is. They always have. Your hollow church is waiting. Your father's journal is on the shelf. Open it. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival, thermal mass, and passive heating. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.